Calgary-Nose Hill.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be splitting my time with the member from Thornhill. And I'd like to start by giving a big shout out and thanks to my colleague, the member from Lethbridge, for all of her exceptionally hard work in stopping this dumpster fire from happening. But here we are tonight. And I think it's really important for people to understand why we're here and what's happening. So I want to break down how what we're dealing with tonight is going to sacrifice Canadian freedom of speech, destroy Canada's capacity for investigative journalism, and divide our country into more extreme views. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to explain what's happened, who's winning and who's losing because of this mess, and debunk the information the Liberals and their coalition partners in the NDP are using to cover up the impact that this bill is going to have on Canadian culture and the economy. So what does this bill do? It creates a link tax. It's going to make digital companies, Facebook, otherwise known as Meta, and Google, with the possibility of TikTok and Twitter following, according to officials, pay a tax to media companies when they post links to the story they create on their sites. The legacy, old media companies want this link tax because their share prices are dropping, because they didn't figure out how to create enough monetizable product to replace print advertising. And so they need other easier sources of income to provide returns to their shareholders and bonuses to their CEOs. A simpler way of understanding this for someone who's watching is trying to remember the last time you bought a physical newspaper. It was probably quite a while ago. And companies that relied on someone reading the ads in those physical papers, they didn't figure out how to make money when people stopped buying them. So now they want the government to step in with this link tax. And to them, this makes sense. They hope the link tax will be a cheap way for them to replace the revenue that they lost on print advertising. But that assumption is very wrong, and we have proof. And this is where things start to affect Canadians in a very negative way. When confronted with this link tax, Facebook and Google simply said this. They said, well, if you're going to make us pay this tax, we're just not going to post the links. And I mean, this kind of makes sense because there's nothing that is actually forcing these companies to post the links. And they have more to gain from a business perspective than to lose if they don't follow through. So the administrative costs of these companies setting up systems to monitor and pay this tax would be very, very high, while the revenue that news links, particularly Canadian news links, make up are a very, very small percentage of their overall traffic. And second, Facebook and Google, in posting media links, actually give free advertising to media companies in that they expose their content to Facebook and Google's massive user base. I'll bet the last time you, Madam Speaker, read a Toronto Star article, you clicked through it on a platform like Facebook, Google, or Twitter. And that's free advertising for the Toronto Star. In testimony, Facebook estimates that they provide about $230 million in free advertising to Canadian media companies and don't get a lot by way of revenue in return. So they've said that if the government passes this bill, they're just not going to post the links to these articles, and they've already started banning links to Canadian news sites for that very reason. And the government wants Canadians to believe that they're the bad guys because of this, but it's because of this piece of legislation that the government is insisting on ramming through. And that creates big problems for everyone. So here's a few of them. This creates problems for print media companies like the ones that are asking for this link tax, because if they lose all the clicks that they would receive from their content being posted on Facebook and Google, they're going to lose a lot of revenue from people looking at digital advertising embedded therein. It also means that less people will find their way to their sites and take out paid subscriptions. And that means less profits for their shareholders and less bonuses for their CEOs. It also means that they're going to fire more journalists. And that's why I think traditional media companies were playing chicken with the Liberals, through the Liberals, with Facebook and Google, thinking that they just weren't going to ban the news, which they're clearly going to do. The second big impact that Facebook, Google, and potentially other platforms banning Canadian news links will have is that Canadians will have less access to the news. And some Canadians who post digital content but don't want to be part of this link tax scheme will have their voices silenced as Facebook and Google stop posting their content too. Small independent firms like, I'm thinking The Line, Canada Land, the Western Standard, they've all said they don't want any part of this because they've adapted and built their business model around today's reality. They feel that when their links are pulled, their ability to reach Canadians will definitely be impacted, and they're probably not wrong. And the fact that the government hasn't addressed this and allowed them to opt out, it raises a lot of very suspicious questions. This link tax means that ethnically, regionally, and gender diverse viewpoints that may not have been platformed in the past by mainstream media outlets like the Toronto Star, that have successfully, and these new voices that have successfully started their own subscriber-based platforms, could be put out of business because of the Liberal NDP link tax. And that means that the same colonial voices in downtown Toronto that have always controlled the news in Canada will still control the news. That is, if their shareholders don't figure out that Facebook and Google aren't going to play ball first. And this means that the young Indigenous woman who wants to start a Substack-based media outlet in her home might never get off the ground. And all of this bill does is favor the profits of a few lazy corporate executives whose most creative business growth strategies has been to keep convincing their Liberal buddies to bail them out without any thought for what this means for the rest of the country. And that's why we're standing against this bill. This is going to cost taxpayers a lot. The Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or the CRTC, is supposed to administer this new link tax. How many more expensive bureaucrats are taxpayers going to have to pay for to administer a program that is going to censor diverse voices and line the pockets of a few corporate executives as they pull the parachute on their flaming wrecks of outdated companies? Couldn't that money have been better spent somewhere else? So when the Liberals and the NDP coalition partners say this is going to support more local media, that's flatly wrong. It's just wrong. It's going to kill regional startup media in their infancy by preventing their content from being exposed to countless people who Facebook and Google will simply ban. They're serious about this. And the Liberal NDP news banning censorship link tax isn't going to hire more journalism as they claim. Any money that does come in is going to go straight to wealthy CEO bonuses and shareholder profit. If this bill was going to result in more journalists being hired, we would see more being hired. But instead, we had the CEO of Bell Media blame gutting of countless newsrooms and radio stations last week, including the termination of some of Canada's most senior journalists like Joyce Napier and Glenn McGregor on the instability caused by this bill. We saw the closure of college-level journalism courses for the same reason. And this bill is also going to create more silos because it's going to force people into small, tiny silos of content as these other platforms shut down because of these link bans. So they're actually causing more divisiveness in our country. They also say that Australia did this. They didn't. What happened was Australia changed their legislation to allow deals to be made outside of the content of this legislation, which is what Facebook did. But yet the Liberals are still careening down this path with the NDP in tow, with all of these negative consequences on display for everyone to see. What the government should be doing instead is working to create a stable way to support actual investigative journalists, like the Bob Fife, the knife that cuts both ways, to be hired. Instead, we're seeing these people be fired. And I think that's actually what they want. I actually think that's what they want on this. They want less scrutiny. They should be allowing people to opt out of this bill. If somebody says, a journalistic outlet says, I don't want to be part of this, I don't want to be part of the ban, they should allow that. But they're not. They didn't amend the bill. They should be telling journalism students and journalists to do this. Get a good understanding of how AI is going to change their jobs, how to build a subscription platform, and how to get good at research, writing, video, and audio content, because that's what journalism is going to look like. And it's going to be so much harder while people are learning those new skills for them to start up as journalists, given how this bill is going to fundamentally transform Canadian journalism for the worse. And the proof's already there. It's already happening. And so for Canadians, you need to know that the government is ramming this through. We're doing everything that we can to stop it, but it's going to go through. And the only way to change that is to subscribe to content from news articles that you trust so it gets right into your inbox and goes around these bans, and also to punish the Liberals and the NDP for destroying democracy, censorship, and diversity in journalism through this bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I'm wondering if the member could provide what the Conservative Party meant in the last election when they had incorporated in their platform that a Conservative government would introduce digital media royalty framework to ensure Canadian media outlets are fairly compensated for the sharing of their content by platforms like Google and Facebook. What did the Conservative Party mean when they made that statement?
The Honourable Member Calgary-Nose Hill.
I can tell you what we didn't mean. This flaming dumpster fire wreck of a bill that the government is ramming through in spite of dozens, hundreds of people, millions of Canadians saying we don't want this. And I offered solutions that the government could have taken that Facebook and Google and other media companies already put on the table, like creating funds that would go directly to investigative journalism instead of going to the rich corporate executives and shareholders of a few dying media companies. If they want ideas from it, we're happy to provide them, but we'll be doing it on that side of the House when our party is government.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank the member for her contribution to this debate. I'm going to ask a similar question on the same topic that I have asked since this debate started some time ago. And the fact that there hasn't been enough discussions about the positive impacts this bill could have for Indigenous producers and the supports that it will give for Indigenous producers. And I wonder if the member agrees that this bill is important so that Indigenous journalists can get the support that they need to make sure that they're part of providing online news to Canadians with an Indigenous perspective.
The Honourable Member Calgary-Nose Hill.
In order for us to actually address reconciliation, there needs to be more Indigenous voices and Indigenous reporting. This bill is going to do the opposite. I think about a young Indigenous woman who wants to start as a journalist to tell her story, the story of her people, and this bill is going to prevent her voice from being shared on some of the platforms that we need to share on today, like Facebook and Google. And that's why I implore this member, who I know cares about this issue, to go to her House Leader, to go to her caucus and say, we can't support this. All this is going to do is empower colonial voices in downtown Toronto that have controlled the media and controlled what Canadians have heard for too long. And it's going to line their pockets and the pockets of their shareholders where diverse voices suffer. And that's why it has to stop.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Maybe the member...
Shore St. Margaret's.
The member for Lethbridge is beginning up to ask questions of the Speaker, but the Speaker is censoring her due to a faulty ruling. So I urge the Speaker to change her ruling and let the people of Lethbridge have a voice in this House.
I do want to remind the Honourable Member that a decision has been rendered. If he wishes to challenge the Chair, I think that he knows what the rules are around that. The Honourable Member, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Madam Speaker. And I had posed a fairly precise question to the member opposite. And I think that the Conservative Party does owe an explanation to Canadians. They campaigned, they promised on bringing forward legislation of this nature that would do what this legislation is doing. Even in their platform, they make reference to Australia and France, which this is actually modeled after. There is no cop-out of an excuse. Why did the Conservative Party backflip and flip-flop on this issue when they promised Canadians that they would support it?
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
It's exactly that type of misinformation that the Liberals want their controlled media sources to be able to spread to Canadians. The reality is when he raises that issue of Australia, Australia amended their legislation so that Facebook and Google could work with journalists to create deals to support journalism that goes directly to journalism outside of the legislative framework, understanding that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. This government has been ramming through this bill without amendments, and I have to ask why. And I think it's because they want their colonial downtown voices of Toronto to keep controlling the media, to keep shutting out voices. He's a member from Western Canada. Do you know that there's no members from Western Canada in the Parliamentary Press Gallery? There might be one, but I think it's zero. We have to change that. And so we should be looking at ways that other witnesses suggested, certainly that's what the Conservative Party would be suggesting, on how to support actual journalism instead of lining the pockets of wealthy corporate executives and their shareholders that are hoping that Canadian tax dollars will squeeze out the last vestiges of their failing, dying business models that we have no responsibility to pick up. We need to be supporting young, diverse voices as they enter the career of journalism in a way that's accountable to Canadians' free speech rights. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate.